Whether you are religious or not, the story of Jesus' execution is more than likely what comes to mind when you hear the word crucifixion. Ordered by Roman official Pontius Pilate, it is considerably the most famous account of this horrific practice. However, the Romans used this form of punishment long before and after the death of Jesus, and are often credited with perfecting the method. So how did they do it? Who is this sort of punishment reserved for, and who inspired them to start doing it in the first place? So sit back and relax, hopefully in a comfy chair rather than a crucifix, and let's examine the Roman history of crucifixion together. But before we begin, it should be noted that some of today's topics will explore some obviously rather brutal and graphic details, and so viewer discretion is advised. The origins of crucifixion. Although crucifixion is primarily associated with the Romans, its origins actually stem from the Persian Empire in early 6th century BCE. The earliest and one of the largest accounts of crucifixion was recorded in 519 BCE when King Darius I of Persia had 3,000 of his political enemies from Babylon crucified. Experts believe that they developed the idea from the Assyrians' use of impalement as not only a form of execution, but also as a statement of power. As wars waged on and stories of these bloody battles traveled, it didn't take long for neighboring cultures to adopt the practice, such as the Greeks, Phoenicians, and the mortal enemies of the Romans, the Carthaginians. Located in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a port city founded in roughly 814 BCE by Phoenician settlers. The city grew rapidly in power due to strong trade routes and developing the largest navy to exist at the time, and by the 4th century BCE, Carthage was the top ruling empire of the Mediterranean. While the history of the Carthaginians is deep and complex enough to warrant its own video, there are two important figures from this empire that are key figures to our topic: Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal Barca, more commonly known simply as Hannibal. Hamilcar Barca was a highly regarded general who served during the first of the three Punic Wars, a set of wars that led to the rise and expansion of the Roman Empire. The first war lasted for 23 years from 264 to 241 BCE, and although Hamilcar commanded a strong army against Roman troops, the Carthaginians did not think it was worth continuing to fight, so they considered the Romans' offer to enter a peace treaty. However, Hamilcar truly believed that a peace treaty was useless and out of the question, and he refused to enter the agreement. As a result, Senate officials bypassed Hamilcar's command and sought approval from another Carthaginian statesman. Carthage ultimately lost to Rome due to the Treaty of Lutatius, which promised the surrender of several major territories to Rome. The agreement and subsequent loss infuriated Hamilcar, and he swore a permanent hate and disdain for Rome, a hate that he made his own son Hannibal promise to hold on to as he took over his father's position as general during the Second Punic War. While both men are highly regarded as the greatest generals to ever hail from the Carthaginian military, Hannibal is often considered to be one of the greatest military men of all time. But I'm sure you're asking yourself by now, what do these men have to do with crucifixion? While it wasn't considered common practice, the Carthaginians did adopt the early process of crucifixion from their Mediterranean neighbours. This early method consisted of tying or nailing the convicted to a vertical post where they would be tortured and ultimately left for dead. Because of the extreme nature of crucifixion, it was typically reserved for the lowest of crimes and political enemies. Following one battle during the Second Punic War, Hannibal ordered the public crucifixion of over 500 Roman prisoners that were captured. It is believed that this was the first time that Romans had witnessed such a punishment, especially on such a large scale. As a result, historians believe that this event planted the seed for the Romans to start using crucifixion as a form of torture against their own enemies. After ultimately defeating the Carthaginians in 146 BCE, Rome officially became the top ruling empire of the developing world, and the practice of crucifixion began to develop with it. Roman development. When the Romans began to use crucifixion as a sentence, they viewed it more as an instrument of torture and humiliation rather than one of simple execution. At first, it was used primarily by the Roman military as a punishment for war prisoners or rogue soldiers. In essence, as Rome had just established itself as a great power in society, it could be argued that Emperor Augustus Caesar popularized crucifixion as a power statement to those who further challenged them. Emperor Tiberius, however, began to use crucifixion on a slightly bigger scale. Under his rule from 14 to 37 AD, crucifixion became a sentence used for any lower class or non-Roman citizen who committed a major crime, including subjective crimes such as challenging different political or religious beliefs. To put this in perspective, if a Roman citizen of a middle to higher class was charged with political treason, they would more than likely face the quick demise of decapitation as their punishment. However, if a slave or prisoner of war was charged with the same crime, more often than not, they would be sentenced to crucifixion. As such, it was during Tiberius's rule that Jesus of Nazareth was notably crucified, more than likely under political charges from a historical context according to various sources. But because crucifixion was considered to be one of the most graphic execution methods, combined with the fact that it mostly applied to lower class citizens, recorded accounts of crucifixion being used on specific individuals were rarely kept, and so most accounts are of mass crucifixions that have been carried out by different emperors and generals throughout Roman history. For example, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, Emperor Nero ordered hundreds of Christians to be crucified after he blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. More famously, after the Third Servile War in 73 to 71 BCE, led by slave and gladiator Spartacus, General Marcus Crassus ordered roughly 6,000 of the surviving slaves to be crucified along the Appian Way, a road which spanned from Rome to Naples. This served as a perfect spot for Roman officials to leave the bodies of the executed slaves as they severely decayed, as it stood as a reminder of the consequences for anyone who thought of attempting such rebellion themselves. The method behind the madness. As it was mentioned previously, crucifixion once meant tying or nailing an enemy or prisoner to a vertical post. This position was known as a crux simplex, and whilst this was still a method that was sometimes used by the Romans, they ultimately developed three distinct styles. Crux commissa, which resembled a capital T shape, crux decussata, which resembled the letter X, and crux immissa, which is the most well-known lowercase T shape. Due to the lack of records of individual cases, it is uncertain if any of these styles were used for specific crimes, but it is certain that the Romans were aware that these different positions could inflict different types of torture. So if any of you have any insight or theories on how these positions were chosen, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Although not many records are kept on the individuals who endured this torture, the Romans did leave behind records and evidence that give us a better insight on how it was typically carried out. Once condemned, the victim would be beaten and whipped in front of a crowd in a public square with an instrument called a scourge, also known as a flagrum or flagellum. This instrument was a small handheld whip that typically had 3 or more leather cords hanging from a handle, and each cord had pieces of metal tied to their ends. This metal would rip the flesh off their victim as it was being used, so you can imagine the excruciating pain these victims were in before the worst even occurred. Once the beating was over, it was time for the actual crucifixion. Many people are under the impression that prisoners would carry the entire cross to their crucifixion site. However, due to the scarcity of wood at the time and the sheer weight of it, the condemned would instead carry their horizontal planks to the site where vertical posts were already erected, allowing them to be reused for the next victims. The horizontal pieces that the victims would carry weighed about 135 to 180 kilograms, or 300 to 400 pounds, so it's speculated that the victims more than likely had their wrists tied to the plank rather than having nails driven through the wrists or hands, although some evidence shows that the latter isn't completely discounted. Forcing the victims to carry these pieces to the crucifixion site not only added to the humiliation and shame that the Roman officials wanted them to experience, but it also put them in a fatigued state that would ultimately lead to their demise. Once they reached the execution site, the victim would be affixed to the cross, often with their name and the crime they committed posted above their head or somewhere close by. Subsequently, they were often just left for death and decay to take over. Sometimes, however, Roman officials would help speed up the process by breaking the victim's legs with an iron club, or stabbing them with spears, sometimes impaling them completely. But for those who suffered a slower fate, medical experts believe that the ultimate cause of death for these victims would have been asphyxiation, as they would have struggled greatly to breathe as they attempted to support their full body weight on these relatively small structures. I think it's also safe to assume that some of these victims more than likely died from other relative factors such as infection from their wounds, internal bleeding, and overall shock from the pain, lack of food or water, and environmental conditions. That said, experts estimate that it would have taken victims anywhere from 6 hours to 4 days to succumb to their condition. I don't think any of us can truly fathom experiencing that sort of pain for up to 6 hours, let alone for 4 days. I mentioned earlier that following all of these gruesome acts, the victims were often left to decay and rot in the hot Roman sun. Regardless of the crime committed and ultimate cause of death, this was typical of crucifixion victims as it further satisfied the purpose of dehumanizing and shaming them. As a final act to add insult to injury, when officials decided it was time to remove the bodies, the remains were often tossed into mass burial pits, where they were forever forgotten. On a more extreme level, there have even been some accounts of the bodies being thrown into the gladiator arenas for wild beasts such as lions to consume. But humiliation wasn't the only motive for using this brutal execution method. The Romans also used this as a fear-mongering tactic against the people, as it was meant to discourage them from committing similar crimes lest they suffer the same fate. However, it wasn't just the idea of this physical torture that incited fear within the people. Like many ancient cultures, the Romans had a very sacred view of death and the afterlife. Because crucifixion was viewed as the highest form of dishonor, it often meant damnation in both the physical world and the spirit world, and so those who were sentenced to crucifixion were also sentenced to eternal suffering. A barbaric practice banned. Crucifixion was a staple in Roman society for roughly 500 years until it was banned in the 4th century AD by Emperor Constantine I. Being Rome's first Christian emperor, it is said that he outlawed the practice out of respect for his new savior, Jesus Christ. It's during his reign that we start to see a small shift in the symbolism of the cross, for what was once viewed as a dark mark of damnation was now, and still is, a beacon of light for Christians all over the world. However, the so-called end of crucifixion is almost as controversial as the act itself. For one, some experts believe that Constantine banned crucifixion on the basis of humanity and mercy rather than out of religious respect. It is said that he replaced crucifixion with hanging as he believed it was a more humane way of execution that still allowed for a public display of power. Despite this, there is some speculation that Constantine actually ordered several of his adversaries to be crucified himself, although none of our sources could completely corroborate this as fact. Constantine's true religious beliefs have been under scrutiny for various reasons, but that's another video for another time. Because of this, and because very little records were ever kept about individual crucifixions, we truly can't say for sure what his motives were for banning crucifixion, if he even truly banned it at all. And even if Constantine did truly ban crucifixion within the Roman Empire, that didn't stop other cultures from adopting the tradition long after his reign. Well, not exactly. Between its pure ghastly nature and religious association, you would think that crucifixion is truly a thing of the past, right? Unfortunately, that statement couldn't be further from the truth. Crucifixion has been used by various societies long after Rome fell, and it's even an execution method still used by some to this day. During the course of World War II, there have been several cases documented of Japanese soldiers crucifying captured prisoners, and it is worth mentioning that there are many historical accounts of crucifixion being used as punishment throughout early Japanese history. But in a more modern light, crucifixion still has a heavy presence throughout the Middle East. During the 2010s, when the terrorist group ISIS was creating shockwaves throughout the world, there were several reports of them using crucifixion against their dissenters, among other grisly execution methods. But that still doesn't mark the end of its use. To this very day, crucifixion is still considered a legal punishment in Saudi Arabia for the most extreme crimes. According to Bloomberg News, in 2018, a man was executed and crucified in the holy city of Mecca after he was charged with breaking into a woman's home and stabbing her to death. Subsequently, in 2019, BBC reported that a man was executed and crucified after being held prisoner on charges of adopting terrorist extremist ideology, forming terrorist cells, and harming the peace and security of society. Ironic when you consider the extreme nature of crucifixion itself, although I guess that depends on your perspective. After everything we've discussed in this video, would you volunteer yourself to experience this ordeal? While most of you would hopefully answer with a resounding no, others may reconsider. In the Philippines, there are several villages where volunteers willingly put themselves through the crucifixion process, from whipping themselves to carrying the wood to being fully nailed or tied to the cross. Some participants even adorn their head with a thorny crown similar to Jesus in an effort to fully reenact his execution. The people who participate in these reenactments state that they do so to prove their love and devotion to Jesus and the church, and they're very open to tourists visiting the spectacle in an effort to spread his word and love. It should be noted, however, that the official Catholic churches in the area do not sponsor or even condone these reenactments, and do not wish to have any association with them. Regardless of whether it's used as a form of punishment or a form of homage, it doesn't look like this ancient and barbaric practice will cease to exist anytime soon. Conclusion. And that, my friends, is the Roman history of crucifixion. Whether you look at it from a religious or historical perspective, it's safe to say that crucifixion is probably one of, if not the most gruesome method of execution ever implemented in human history. Therefore, it's no real surprise that the Romans are the society credited for conjuring the images we think of when we hear the word today. Considering the somber nature of this video, it feels odd to say that we hope you enjoyed it, but we certainly do nonetheless. So thank you so much for watching, please do subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers!